There is a woman who has been crying on the banks of American rivers for longer than the rivers themselves have been called American. In Spanish, they have always named her plainly La Llorona, the woman who weeps. In the archival work I do, she is not one story but 1,000 records, carrying one sound. And I have spent this past year learning to read her the way you read a weather system, by watching what she does when no one is looking. I am an archivist. I spend my days with documents no one else will read: deeds, court records, letters, municipal files, the small print of other people's lives that outlives the people themselves. And I do not believe in La Llorona the way I believe in a document. I believe in her the way the people who wrote those documents did, which is to say, I have read enough to grant her a certainty of her own. So let me make the shape of this clear at the start, because honesty about sources is the only thing an archivist owns outright. The history you are about to hear is real, and it is documented. I will tell you where every layer comes from, and I will tell you when a claim is folklore rather than fact. The woman telling it to you is not real. She is a fiction, a character wrapped around research, the way a story wraps around a fact. I say that once clearly, so that nothing after it can be mistaken. The legend is true in the way legends are true. It was believed, it was repeated, it shaped lives, and it changed the way mothers and children moved around water for 400 years. The narrative frame around it is invented to carry the weight. If you remember one boundary tonight, remember that one. I catalog the records of a city in the American Southwest, on the edge of the Rio Grande, in a region where La Llorona is not a curiosity, but a household fact. Ask any child on this border whether you should cross the irrigation ditch after nightfall, and the answer she gives you will not mention archives. It will mention her. She is the name whispered in Spanish and in English, in kitchens and in schoolyards, by grandmothers who cross the river and by grandchildren who have never seen it. She is, in the simplest terms, the most famous ghost in the Americas, and the strangest part of her fame is how stubbornly it stays local. Every river that has ever run beside a Spanish-speaking town claims a version of its own. Tonight I have brought the records home with me. They begin in a Mexico that was being written down at the point of a sword, and they end, if you will forgive the frame, on a night when I had to decide whether a sound outside my daughter. Swindle was the wind or something with a name. We will walk that distance together, and I will point out the seams as we cross them. Let us start at the start. With paper, the earliest layer of the written record takes us to the 16th century, to the years after the Spanish entered the Valley of Mexico. That conquest produced a flood of documents, because empires and churches both wanted an account of what they had found and what they had undone, and indigenous scribes wrote it all down within living memory of the old world. One of the best known of those documents is the Florentine Codex, a monumental ethnographic work compiled between 1547 and 1577 by the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagin, with the help of Nahua informants, students, and artists. It is an early draft of Mexican memory, an attempt to record the languages, beliefs, and history of the people the conquest had overtaken. It is also the first source scholars routinely point to when they try to date the sound of the weeping woman, because among the omens that the text records as having preceded the fall of Tenochtitlan, there is a recurring figure, a woman heard wailing in the night. The cry comes before the catastrophe, filling the dark streets with a grief that belongs to nobody and to everybody. This is where I have to be careful with you, the way I am careful with the documents themselves. An omen of a crying woman is not the same thing as the full legend of La Llorona. Between the 16th century note and the stories told today stand 400 years of retelling, and no single manuscript proves a straight line from one to the other. To claim it did would be bad scholarship, and I have made my living on the difference. What the old documents do prove is something more interesting than a straight line. They prove that the sound of a woman weeping at night already meant something to the people hearing it. It was read as a warning, as a thing that should make a household hold its children close and bar its doors. That meaning did not have to be invented later. It was already attached to the cry. And I want to be honest about the limits of the record too, because the Florentine Codex is not a neutral camera. It was assembled by a missionary and his students, working in a colonial world, with their own purposes and their own audience. The omens they preserved are precious. They are also a selection, filtered through the people who chose to write them down. So the oldest attested layer is not a photograph of a ghost. It is a document about belief, written by believers, at the moment when the world it described was collapsing. And that, in its own way, is closer to the truth of La Llorona than any photograph could be. She has always lived at the level of what people fear and what they pass on, not at the level of what can be proved. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the figure appears all over the written record of a Mexico that was now Spanish. Not in one authoritative text, but scattered through sermons, lawsuits, ballads, and the testimony of witnesses. The heart of the tradition that scholars and storytellers alike describe is a colonial story. And here is the shape it takes. A woman named Maria in many versions drowned her children in a river or in the canal that ran through the colonial city, in a rage or in a grief. When the water closed over them, she understood what she had done, and she has walked the banks since that night, drenched and calling for them. Doomed to search forever for children, she threw away with her own hands. The variations are almost numberless, and every one of them is a small confession about its teller. Sometimes she kills her children to punish a man who abandoned her. Sometimes she kills them because a man told her he could not love a woman with heirs. Sometimes she goes mad and the children are lost while she's not herself. In every version the ending is identical, a mother who cannot stop calling. Scholars argue about whether the story is a transplant or a native plant. Some see echoes of European tales of women betrayed into killing their children. Others show how neatly the figure fits the anxieties of a colonial city. Widows stripped of protection, orphans, young mothers with almost no rights at all. A world where a woman standing could collapse in a single season. What is safe to say is that the Mexican tradition, as we know, it took its shape in the colonial world, and that every century since has added a layer of its own. She has been a sermon against sin, a warning to unfaithful husbands, a source of comfort, and a threat to send children home at dusk. A ghost that useful does not fade. She gets dressed by each generation and sent out again. Now the most famous attempt to push her deeper into the past. Some scholars connect La Llorona to Cihuacoatl, a Mexican mother goddess, a figure that surviving sources associate with childbirth, with the aftermath of war, and in some accounts with a voice that cried out in the night when the city was in peril. The parallels are real enough that they have attracted serious thinkers for a century. I have to stop here and be honest with you, because archives are full of people who were damaged by a confident sentence. The connection to Cihuacatl is a scholarly interpretation. It is a theory built from parallels and fragments, a serious hypothesis held by serious scholars, but it is not a proven genealogy, and the pre-Hispanic evidence for the goddess herself is thin and written down only after the conquest. A storyteller who presents Cihuacoatl as the plain and certain origin of La Llorona is asking you to believe more than the documents can carry. I will not do that to you. What the documents carry is this: a pre-conquest world in which women's grief was already being read as a warning, and a colonial world that turned that reading into a story with a river in it. Let the boundary hold there, because that is the difference between scholarship and folklore, and both are valuable if you refuse to mix them. The scholarly claim is that echoes, parallels, and the cultural climate connect the old goddess figure to the new legend. The folk claim is simpler and older, that the same cry has been walking toward the water since before anyone wrote it down. I keep both claims on the same shelf because the archive is not an either, or it is a both, and written over time. If you ask me what the documents prove, I will give you the scholarly answer and stop. If you ask me what the tradition has always insisted on, I will give you the folk answer and hold your gaze. The skill is in never pretending one is the other. By the 19th century, the legend was continental, and this is where the record opens up into a field instead of a single furrow. Wherever Spanish was spoken and water ran, a version of her grew, and the versions began to drift apart in beautiful and telling ways, the way a language drifts into dialects when its speakers stop meeting. In Mexico City, the versions keep her close to the old canals and the great draining works of the valley, the waterways that once crossed the lakebed city and the ones that replaced them. She is a city ghost there, a sound heard beside stone and water, a warning built into the plumbing of a place that was always trying to keep the water out or let it through. Farther south, in the country and along the rivers of the countryside, she is a rural figure again, seen at fords and washes, heard where a child might wander and be lost. The setting changes, the dress changes, but the mechanics of the warning do not. A woman at the water, a child near the edge, and the mother's cry that means the child should be indoors. In Central America, the versions deepen in their own way. In Guatemala and Honduras, she is sometimes described as carrying what the listener understands to be a child, even when her arms appear empty, because the child is the one she lost, and she is always carrying the shape of the loss. The detail is not sentimental. It is a way of telling you exactly what is at stake. In Colombia and Venezuela, she is often spoken of as a woman in white or grey, heard beside rivers and streams that run fast through the mountain. And there the warning tends to attach itself to the hour as much as the water, the dangerous time when the light fails and the world stops belonging to the living. Whole families have been raised keeping children from the banks at dusk. In Peru and elsewhere high in the Andes, she falls into local traditions of mountain and water spirits, until her name is sometimes the only Spanish thing about her. What survives in every telling, across every border, is the triad. The folklorists return to again and again, a woman, a body of water, and the warning about a child. And then the legend crossed into what is now the United States, the way families crossed it. And the crossing changed her, the way the journey changed everyone. Spanish-speaking towns from California to Texas told of a weeping woman seen near rivers, acequias, and the desert roads that follow the watercourses. The irrigation ditch became her river. The boundary became her home. In the American Southwest, folklorists began collecting her in earnest in the 20th century, walking the same ground the stories walked, and they found the tradition in full motion. English-speaking children learned her name too, from the same wells of fear and warning that taught them not to swim alone or wander into the dark. And the story traveled in both languages across the border states: New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, Colorado. The collections keep the same grammar wherever they were gathered. She lost her children to water. She weeps, and some child in the telling is standing too close to the edge while no one watches, which is the moment the story exists to prevent. That is the structure of a warning, and it is worth an archivist's attention, because it is a fact about the story rather than a fact inside it. La Llorona does not hunt in the way a monster hunts. She repeats in the way a tragedy repeats. What is alive in her is grief, not appetite, and that is exactly what makes her useful to the people who pass her on. Every folklorist who has studied her notices the same thing. The story takes a real and measurable danger, water, night, a child alone, and gives it a face, a name, and a sound, so the warning can be inherited without anyone having to learn it the hard way. She is a safety phrase 4 centuries old, laced with terror, so it will be remembered. The 20th century made her famous without changing her. She moved into Mexican cinema, onto the radio, into popular song and folklore collection, and the presses on both sides of the border returned to her regularly, printing accounts of a woman seen beside a river, always unverified, always local, always the same shape. Horror magazines gave her a Hollywood dress. Novelists borrowed her for pathos and for menace. Psychologists wrote papers about what she teaches children about fear. And through all of it, the core of the tradition barely moved. She loses her children. She weeps beside water. And someone who hears her is supposed to carry the warning home instead of the curiosity. There is even a small, well-documented history of towns reporting her. A woman glimpsed at the river's edge, a cry recorded on a porch, a hunt, organized and resolved by county authorities to satisfy the neighbors. Local newspapers into the late 20th century filed these as human interest items, complete with the inevitable official who says there was nothing there, and the inevitable mother who doubles the lock anyway. Some scholars read her against the great paired images of Mexican womanhood, the Virgin and the figure of La Malinche, and see in La Llorona a third possibility, a grief the community uses to steer its children toward safety rather than toward loss. That reading is an interpretation, and I give it to you clearly labeled as one, the way the archive requires. But the pattern beneath it is visible in every version I have ever catalogued, from the 16th century omens to the porch, sitting grandmothers telling, whether she is ancient or colonial, goddess or ghost, she exists in the story to be heard in time. The whole point of the weeping woman is that you are listening before it is too late. That is what she is for. That has always been what she is for. Now the part I cannot file. This is the fiction, and I want you to know it is fiction, the way you know a mirror is glass before you touch it. My family has lived along this river for 3 generations. My grandmother was born in a village, the river almost 2. My mother keeps a photograph of it, brown water and a white church, in the same drawer as her marriage license and her mother's death certificate. We are ordinary border people, which is to say, the water is in the blood, and the water's warnings are in the houses. So when my daughter, who is 7, began talking about a lady who cries by the river, I did what anyone in my family would do. I listened. Sophia is not a child who invents terrors. She reports them calmly, the way she reports the weather, and her calm was the first thing that made my chest go tight. The lady sits on the far bank, Sophia told me, under the cottonwoods, and she calls. I asked her what the lady calls out, expecting the wordless cry of the old stories, and my daughter looked at me with the patience a child reserves for slow adults, and she said, your name, not hers, mine. I want you to understand what that specific detail did to me, because I have read every version of the legend, and the cry does not call a mother's name. In the tradition, she calls for her children. The lost ones, never anyone living and never by name. What my daughter described belonged to no teller I had ever filed. That was the moment the archive stopped covering for me. That week, in the archive, I found a municipal petition from 1919. A group of mothers asking the city to light the path along the canal, worded with a politeness that barely hid their fear. The petition mentions a weeping heard at night near the water service road, and it requests lamps so the children of the district can come home in light. I have handled 1,000 such papers and felt nothing. I set that one down and I drove home fast. The coincidence was exact, and I am not old enough to believe the world is tidy. What frightened me was not the note itself. It was how little of the note surprised me, as if some part of me had been expecting it, as if I had been walking toward this filing cabinet. My whole working life, my husband, Daniel, grew up in Los Angeles and believes in 3 kinds of things: money, doctors, and football. He was not worried. He said it was a bobcat. or a coyote, or the river, tricking the ear. He is not a bad man. He is just not of this place. He does not understand that on this border, a child who speaks calmly about a lady, who knows her mother's name, has already been given a reply. My mother understood. My mother said nothing at all, which was her way of saying everything. She sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and watched the water through the window until the light left it. And then she went around the house in the old ritual that is not a superstition to us, closing the curtains, checking the back door, gathering the family inside before the dark. Sophia went on a little more each night. She said the lady never crossed the river because the lady had to stay where the water was. She said the lady was sorry, very sorry, and would be sorry forever. And she said the lady asked her one question over and over, the way children ask the same question on a long drive until there were a groove in it. Whether Sophia's mother was careful, whether I was careful with the water, careful with the child, careful in the way the old women mean when they say the word like a commandment. That is the whole of it, in every version, in every century. Careful, careful, a mother on the far bank begging another mother to hold the line she failed to hold herself. I checked the records backward then, the professional habit that I had and that I still do not regret. I pulled every drowning, every near miss, every unexplained cry filed in the district in my lifetime. The ones the families reported in Spanish and the ones the county wrote up in English. And I laid them out in order, like a river dividing around a stone. There were 14 in 4 decades, and in every single one the pattern held: the water, the child, the mother's warning arriving a little too late, or arriving and being ignored, because it sounded like a story. I sat with the folder in the quiet archive, and I thought about the difference between a warning that works and a warning that merely makes the telling. We were alone. Daniel was working late in the city. My mother was asleep in the next room, and Sophia came to my bed at 2:30, small and precise, the way a grown-up arrives carrying bad news. She stood in the dark and said the lady was closer tonight. She said the water had gone quiet, the way it does before a storm takes its paces. I should have done the careful thing. I should have held my daughter, refused the conversation, and waited for morning. Instead, I did a thing no archivist should ever do. I got up and I went to the window, and I looked at the path by the canal, and I saw that the path was empty, the way a stage is empty, which is to say filled with the expectation of a player. There was a figure on the path, and it was not a coyote, and it was not the wind. It was a woman, and she was facing my house, and she was weeping the way loss actually sounds, without any dignity left in it, the way grief sounds before the world teaches it to behave. The sound came through the glass and filled the room, and my daughter, behind me, whispered, "She has come to be sure. I have argued with myself for years about the next seconds, about whether the fear was real or the imagination of a tired mother, about whether the shape in the dark moved or only the clouds moved, and my eyes did. It does not matter in the end, because whatever was out there, I made the only decision the story allows. I let go of the curtain. I walked back to Sophia. I put my hands on her shoulders, the way my mother's hands were put on mine, and I said the only true sentence I had. We are careful, I told her. We are careful with the water. That is all it is ever about, in any version, in any century. The careful ones are the ones the story lets go. I went back to the window. The path was empty. The water was running again, and the cottonwoods were only cottonwoods. And the night had closed around whatever I had seen, until it was indistinguishable from what I had imagined. By morning, I had told myself it was a 7-year. Olt's imagination working on the grandmother's stories and the mother's fear, which is the most generous explanation available. And I believed that, honestly, until the day I found the sequel in the record. The way this story always finds its sequel in the record. The following year's municipal log, a clerk's note, 1 line, dated the same night. A single report of a woman seen beside the canal, weeping, and the responding officer finding nothing. and writing. In the dry hand of a man at the end of a shift, probably the Llorona. That line is in the record. You can read it the way I finally learned to read it, as a joke in a tired clerk's hand. A piece of local color, the cost of living in a place where the legend is not a legend, but a bus schedule. And you can read it the way my grandmother would read it if she were still beside the brown water, which she almost was for 91 years. She would not be surprised. She would say the story has always been true in the way the oldest things are true. It does not matter whether the woman was there, she would say. It matters that the warning was there, and that on one night a mother heard it in time to keep her daughter home from the water. The way the warning was heard in time, the way it is meant to be heard. An archivist's grace is that I can hold both answers at once. The clerks and the grandmothers, without needing to settle the account. The clerk saw an unremarkable night through a tired man's eyes. The tradition saw a walk by from the oldest fear in the valley. Both of them filed it, and both of them are a part of the same river. I am an archivist. I keep the line in a file where I can find it, and I keep the folder of 14 drownings where I can find it, and I keep Sophia off the path after dark, the way my mother kept me, and her mother kept her, and the river keeps the names of everyone who was not careful. What I have learned, filing her for all these years, is that La Llorona does not need to be believed. She needs to be transmitted, and she is transmitted perfectly. Every generation, without a single instruction manual. The warning travels because the fear is true, and the fear is true because the water is true, and the water will always be there after dark, waiting to take what carelessness hands it. So tonight, if you live anywhere near moving water, and you hear a woman crying by the bank, you do not need to know her history to know what to do. You gather your children, you check your lock, and you are careful, the way every version of the story, in every language, in every century, has ever asked of you. That is the only ending the tradition has ever allowed, and the only one that has ever worked. She weeps. You listen, and you decide with the water still running, whether you are the one who was warned, or the one who was careless. The river does not care which one you are. It has been waiting a long time to find out.